girly pops and boys and everything in between. I'm on my psychiatry rotation. We just have seen a wealth of amazing people, very interesting mental conditions, and I'm here to explain to you the Mental Health Act, which is something we will be seeing in action, or I have seen in action, over the past 5 weeks. It's really important. It was written in 2007, and it basically outlines the exact conduct of healthcare professionals with regards to people with mental illnesses, which is really, really cool. So, in second year, all that we learned was that basically a person could be scheduled if they were considered to have a mental illness, to help make sure that they were receiving their treatment, that they were taking care of themselves. But I remember having no idea what scheduling actually means. So, let's break this down. So, I've got here, ignore all of this first. I'm going to start, hopefully that lasts. I'm going to start by differentiating between voluntary and involuntary patients. And I've made a very purposeful decision to leave this entire column as the freedom column. So voluntary patients or patients who've been discharged back into the community. And I think it's a really important thing here to note, and a lot of amazing psychiatrists keep emphasizing this to us, that the Mental Health Act, the main principle, is all about the least restrictive mode of care. Because it's a massive thing to make a patient involuntary and to keep them as such. Like taking away your freedom, taking away your sense of self is really disempowering for the patient, and it's seriously one of the most horrible experiences for them. So you want to do everything you can to move people from this side to this side. All right, so having said that, moving into why someone might be sectioned, why someone's freedom might be taken away from them. So patients can become involuntary inpatients through 3 channels. The first is the Section 19. Section as in section of the Mental Health Act. So the Section 19, also known as the Schedule 1, can be written by any medical staff or an accredited healthcare worker. So that could be like a mental health accredited nurse, for example. So the form can be completed anywhere. So it could be completed out in the community, at an outpatient center. It could be completed in ED or an ortho or wherever a patient may be deemed to be mentally ill and in need of admission to the mental health ward as an involuntary patient. And just to show you what it looks like, this is what the Schedule 1 looks like. So it's known as the medical certificate as to examination or observation of a person. You basically fill out some details about the person, and they'll circle either one of these. Either they think this person's mentally ill or mentally disordered, which I will go into in a second, and provide evidence of why you think they're mentally ill or mentally disordered, and then provide a general kind of assessment on them. All right, so that's the Section 19. You'll see this written in patients' notes when they come in. Another common admission is through Section 20, which is where someone's brought in by ambulance and they have been deemed to be potentially mentally disordered or mentally ill. And then you also have very commonly, especially in the emergency, Section 22, where police will bring a patient in. And then you have different variations in between. So other sections, which I'm not sure the names of or the numbers of, can have you brought in involuntarily. For example, a magistrate at a court hearing could decide that a patient is potentially mentally ill or mentally disordered, and therefore needs to be brought in as an involuntary patient. So these are the three main examples that you'll see in psychoemergency and for me in psychogeriatrics. And I'll also note here that on the police form, they will also indicate if they want the patient back after treatment for various reasons. All right, so imagine you've come in, you're either here against your will, brought in by ambulance, police, or a medical person, or you've admitted yourself because you feel like you're at a risk to yourself. So what happens now is that within 12 hours of your admission and within 12 hours of being scheduled, you have to be seen by any registered medical officer, so any doctor. And what they're going to do is complete something called a Form 1. So a Form 1 is specifically psychiatric, and it is an assessment of whether or not a person is mentally disordered or mentally ill. So in order to complete this, the doctor will go and take a full history from the patient, ask them about certain symptoms of mental illness, and then fill out this form, which is down here. It's green, you'll see it a lot. And it's basically, it writes down reasons why the patient is mentally ill or mentally disordered. So to go through the definitions of mentally disordered versus mentally ill, and again, these terms are really, really stigmatizing, and it's important to know their exact definitions. And it's also good to know that using these words on a person means that you're taking away their freedom. So I've learned that a lot of doctors are really careful in their way of describing people with certain symptoms. So a mentally ill person, I'll start here, is a person with a severe mood disorder, for example, major depressive disorder or a somatization disorder like anxiety, or perhaps bipolar or borderline personality disorder, or they're showing signs of schizophrenia. And in addition to this, they have created and they are an identifiable risk to themselves or others. And here specifically, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a physical risk or not. So this could be risk to reputation, like if a person's walking around naked on the street. This could be a risk to their finance, like if during a manic episode they start spending unwisely. A risk to their relationships, if they have marital distress and it's taking a huge toll on their family or their siblings or their children. If it's a risk to their employment, or of course, if there's any risk of physical harm, for example, violence or suicidal intention or ideation. Also note here that often in notes you'll see these words. So SI is suicidal ideation, thoughts of self-harm, and thoughts of harm to others. That's something that I saw a lot and I had no idea what it meant, but that's what you mean. Also, mentally ill, MI, not myocardial infarction. I've made that mistake. Now, so if a person is mentally ill, it's likely that they have a formal diagnosable mental illness, as in diagnosable using the DSM-5. However, you also can get a mentally disordered person who's not necessarily mentally ill, so they might not fit the criteria in the DSM-5, but they are acutely irrational and they are at risk of physical harm, either to themselves or they're putting others at risk of physical harm. So a lot of drunk people, intoxicated people, will come in and they get sectioned and and determined to be mentally disordered. Now, it's important to distinguish between these because people with mental illness versus people who are mentally disordered go down completely different involuntary treatment paths, which I'll go through in a bit. However, if a person is assessed using the Form 1 and they're determined to be neither mentally ill or mentally disordered, they're either discharged out into freedom, which is wonderful, or if they really feel like they should be here in the hospital because they feel like they're a risk to themselves. For example, if a patient is so depressed and even though they're not, doing any risky things at the moment, they feel like they could lapse back into a suicidal ideation sometime soon and they're seeking help, they could go down the voluntary pathway, which means they're admitted, but they still have freedom and they're a voluntary patient. I just said that 10 times. I hope that makes sense. All right, so coming back to our patients who are involuntary, so now either mentally ill or mentally disordered. So they've now been admitted because it's confirmed that they do indeed belong in the psych ward as an involuntary patient. So this first exam was done by any doctor. It can be a psychiatrist, it can be a reg, it can be a JMO. However, after this, every single involuntary patient needs to have another review and another Form 1, so the second Form 1, done by the most senior psychiatrist consultant. Well, not the most senior, but a psychiatrist consultant, so a CMO or a VMO. And then they go down one of 3 pathways. So ideally, for example, if they were acutely intoxicated and they were admitted, they would eventually come out as either neither mentally ill nor mentally disordered, which means they would have one more exam just to confirm, and then they would get discharged. And I'll go into these terms a bit later. However, if during the second exam the consultant does confirm that the patient is mentally disordered or mentally ill, then actions are taken. So at this point, a patient's only been here for a few hours. This all must happen in a very, very short space because the Mental Health Act itself states that it's illegal to keep a patient for more than 3 days involuntarily unless you take them to tribunal and receive an involuntary patient order, which we'll get to in a second. So all within 3 days, we've assessed them. They've either come out mentally disordered or mentally ill. So I'm going to go down the mentally disordered pathway first. So the psych consultant comes, they've decided a person is acutely irrational and at risk of physical harm to self or others. Oops. So at this point, they stay in the ward. They're going to be reviewed every 24 hours for 3 working days. This is why, before a public holiday, consultants are rushing to see all of their patients because they want to work out whether or not they want to discharge them or whether or not they need to schedule them again. So after they're reviewed, they're either discharged because they're not mentally disordered anymore, or if they're still mentally disordered, you have to go back to Section 19 and schedule them again and go through this entire process again, and hopefully they get discharged. However, if they have been determined to be mentally disordered more than twice, they become classified as mentally ill. All right, so coming back to that second assessment from the consultant. So we've had someone come in, they've been scheduled, they've had one exam by any doctor, and now they've been examined by a consultant. And the consultant decides that they're mentally ill. This sets up a whole legal process. It sets off a whole legal process. So now the hospital has decided a person has a mental illness and they are at risk to themselves or to others. So the hospital wants to keep the patient against their will, take away their freedom, and keep them in hospital to treat them until they get better and until they can organize appropriate supports for the patient to function in the community. So, what must happen next is what is known as the tribunal. And hopefully during placement we get to all sit in on one of these. It's very interesting. So, after a patient is determined to be mentally ill, the doctors must fill out forms and request a mental health inquiry. So what this is it's basically a tiny little court hearing. It's got a magistrate, the patient's there, the patient's legal representative, and a doctor. I don't know why there's a bracket there. And what happens is the magistrate presides, the patient presents their case together with, if they want, their primary carer can also talk on their behalf. If they, and their legal representative can also talk on their behalf. And then the doctor, the psych reg or the psych consultant, will say, hey court, hey tribunal, I've got this patient, she's been delusional, she's been hallucinating, she's been trying to kill herself, and every time we've released her out into the world, she relapses, and we really need to keep her against her will or involuntarily in the hospital to get her better. And so basically the magistrate, the magistrate decides whether or not the patient should be kept involuntarily or discharged. A couple of notes here is that the patient has to be on the minimal amount of medication that is required for sedation. So the patient should be able to hear and see and understand what's going on. And often patients are sedated with medications such as benzodiazepines. So it must be declared whether or not a patient's judgment may be impaired. Also, a patient must be accounted, their cultural and linguistic diversities must be accounted for, so translator must be present if required. All right, so again, we've got a patient, they've come in, they've had 2 exams, they've gone now to tribunal, and the magistrate has ruled that they need to be kept in hospital for their own safety. This is when an involuntary patient order, or an IPO, is, given out, end of the day, brain dead. So the psych doctor, psych reg or the psych consultant, during the tribunal would have requested a certain number of weeks during which they believe they can get the patient better and they can get the patient discharged. The maximum is 12 weeks. And if at the end of those 12 weeks or 3 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever, if they think that the patient is not better, then you go back to this pathway. And this can go on forever until the patient is completely better. Ideally, a patient will make a full recovery, or at least stop being at risk of harm to themselves or others. And this can lead to them being discharged. And this is where it comes to these little terms that I thought I'd mention, but can be read about in a lot more detail. So something that I've seen really commonly for patients who are about to be discharged, but they have a history of not taking their medications or performing, risky business, etc., not taking charge of their own health. This is when a CTO might be issued. And this, again, is a massive legal process because you're putting the patient out into the community, but technically they're still involuntary. Because what a CTO does is it basically is an order for the patient to receive treatment in the community, probably against their will. So this means that they'll keep on their medications, which will mean that they are kept, their mental illness is managed well, and therefore they are not at risk of harm to themselves or others. So again, least restrictive care. I also mentioned guardianship, which is basically where the National Civil and Administrative Tribunal appoints someone for a person who's mentally ill and incapable of managing their own health. They appoint someone to take care of this person, to look out for them, and to basically make decisions and consent for the patient as their guardian. And so hopefully at the end of all of this, the patient gets to go home, or they get to go to a nursing home, or wherever is most appropriate for them. And during this whole time, whilst all this has been going on, while they've been staying on the ward, the social workers involved, the physios involved, the OTs come to assess their house. They've probably received all the medical care they can get. They can receive community packages to help assist them out in the community. And so when they're discharged, as well as receiving medication reviews, they're also hopefully going to remain functional and safe out in the community, which is all very important, and which is what I admire so much about psych, because there's so many disciplines involved in making sure that this patient who's right here at the end of their journey doesn't relapse and doesn't end up coming back in. And that's why things like community treatment orders and guardianship are so important, because if a patient is just discharged and they are not taking their medications, or if they haven't received any community treatment packages community assistance packages, and they are being discharged to homelessness, which is unfortunately a lot of what we see in psych emergency, then they're just going to end up coming back in. And we've seen so many people who just keep going. And so the best way to manage this is to get that multidisciplinary involvement, and to really consider the patient's biopsychosocial circumstances, because psych is holistic and it's all about the person, and it's all about keeping them as safe as possible. So yeah, that is, ignore that. That is the Mental Health Act in a nutshell. That's all you need to know. So now you know if you see Section 19, Section 20, Section 22, or if you hear of a tribunal happening, if you hear of a CTO, if you hear of guardianship, like all of this stuff is stuff that I just had no idea what it was. So hopefully this helps. And this is Vabway. Thanks for listening. Thanks. All right. Bye.